So we figured since we had a hostage audience, we'd take the opportunity to talk a little bit about the Bretton Woods Committee. It's obvious to me, in fact, that it came up a couple of times, what is the Bretton Woods Committee and, where did it come from? What is its origins? What does it do? And what are you seeking to do? And so I thought this might be a useful opportunity to spend half hour talking with Bill to be able to shed some light on what the committee is, where it comes from, etc. So, Bill, why don't we start with the history? The foundations of the committee, etc., and then maybe we can talk later to things like membership and so on.
Okay, so this all harkens back to 1944 when there was a Bretton Woods conference at the Bretton Woods Hotel in New Hampshire, where they got together and figured out we need a new international order because we've just gone through a Great Depression and gone through World War II, and so how can we actually have financial stability going forward? And out of the Bretton Woods conference came the World Bank and the IMF. A number of years later, but not too many years later, the Bretton Woods Committee was formed. And the notion behind the Bretton Woods Committee is the idea that solutions that involve international coordination and cooperation are going to be far superior to every country just going their own way. So the idea is that if we cooperate, we set global standards rather than individual country standards. If we figure out how we can aid countries when they're hit with shocks, be they climate shocks or business cycle shocks, we can have better outcomes over the longer term. So the Bretton Woods Committee, when I came on the scene, was being led by Paul Volcker, Jim Wolfenson, and Dick Debs, and they were getting along in years, and they were trying to figure out, okay, what should we do next? And they gave me the opportunity to pick up the banner from them, and I thought this was something that, since I was completely committed to the philosophy of international cooperation, coordination beats chaos, that I decided to take up this banner. But what I also wanted to do when I took up this banner, and this is working very closely with Emily Slater, who's our very able executive director, was to take us in a more modern direction. So not just refer back to the Bretton Woods Conference and the IMF and the World Bank, but to really focus on where we're going forward in the future. And a couple of aspects of that. Number one, international cooperation and coordination is broader than what just the IMF and the World Bank does. Climate is a good example. Trade, World Trade Organization, health. There's a whole bunch of areas where this is an important venue. Second, that the Bretton Woods Committee had a very U.S.-centric orientation. If you look at our membership and where we had events, it was heavily populated by U.S. members. And if we're really in favor of international cooperation and coordination on a global basis, it's pretty obvious that the Bretton Woods Committee need to get a lot more global. And so we've reached out around the world, and we have people on our board of directors now from all over the world, on our advisory council from all over the world. Piyush is on our advisory council. And we're continuing to grow this institution globally. And that was obviously the motivation for doing this event with DBS today, is to take this on the road to Asia. And we're hoping to come back on a regular basis. Before I go on, I just want to thank Piyush and DBS and the staff for all the tremendous work. We couldn't have done this on our own. We had tried to do this on our own, we would have had one table with 5 people sitting over there, and I'm not sure.
You don't know, actually, Bill. Just offer free food in Singapore, everybody comes.
But our partners have been extraordinary, helpful, and generous in bringing this to passage. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the kind words. But I want to go back to, my association through the 80s and 90s. A lot of the work, Bill Rhodes was part of this, was around the sovereign debt restructuring issue, the Latin American debt crisis. And so can you shed some light on, what Bretton Woods Committee was able to achieve then? But more important, this is one that still continues to be a big agenda for the committee. And so where we are in world economics today, again, a number of countries who are on the verge, especially the smaller emerging markets, who are on the verge of a similar kind of crisis. So again, as we go forward, where do you see this headed? Is there a role for multilateral cooperation in that regard, and how's that coming along?
Well, I have to say, I mean, we're not in a great part of the circle right now. We're in sort of the vicious part of the circle rather than the virtuous part of the circle, in the sense that globalization is actually unwinding. The pressure on low and moderate income countries is increasing, partly due to what we talked about before about the U.S. macro environment and the Federal Reserve tightening monetary policy very, very aggressively. So we're sort of going in the wrong direction. But my view is, since we're going in the wrong direction, the need for these kind of efforts becomes even more important rather than less important. The other thing I think that's really important is, we have a lot of global problems that really are much bigger than what any individual country can address on their own. I mean, when you think of climate change, for example, and we'll come back to this in a bit, I'm sure, climate change is not about what the United States does. It's really about, if we don't have India and China on board in a serious way, we're not going to be successful with climate change in taking this forward as an agenda. And I think this is true for a lot of different areas. U.S. is becoming less important in the world, I think it's fair to say. China is becoming a lot more important in the world, and I think one of the challenges that we see, both at the Bretton Woods Committee, but just generally, is we need to bring China into the conversation as an active participant in the conversation, because we're not going to get anywhere if they're not, fully engaged and involved.
So now, two subtexts to this question, though. So, one you mentioned earlier in the state, I think you're right, that at the end of the day, a lot of the people and institutions are inward looking for a good reason. Like you said, Raghuram Rajan used to keep making the case about the extraterritorial impact of the Fed's monetary policy agenda. It spills over around the world. And yet, as you correctly said, I mean, the FOMC's got a mandate to look after the US interests. And so, yes, we are unhappy about what happens to you, but what do you want us to do? So in that context, is this idea of really being able to coordinate policy actions, do things together, multilateralism, is that utopian, or do you think it still work?
Look, I don't think it's easy to reach these solutions, but I think there's a number of examples where we've actually, you see examples of where there have been these kind of cooperative solutions. I mean, think about what's been done after the great financial crisis in terms of making the global financial system much more resilient and robust. I mean, the Basel Committee came out and promulgated much tougher capital standards that were then taken across the world. I worked very deeply on principles for financial market infrastructures to make central clearing counterparties much more robust. And I think that actually works. So I think, everyone has to see it in their interest to participate in this process. But if you can get people to come along, they will get benefits of having the broader community involved. I mean, so let me turn it around and ask you a question. So I'm in the United States, and the United States is obviously a big player. You're in Singapore, which is
not a big player.
Well, an important player, but not a big player. But you're trying to navigate through all these different forces where you have China on one hand, the U.S. on the other hand, that are drifting apart. How does Singapore think about all these issues?
Well, it's a great question, Bill. And for countries like us, small countries, we are price takers. And when you're a price taker, then it always helps to make sure that you have an international set of rules so you can make sure that there is a balance in the price taking. The problem is if you're a big country and you're not a price taker, but you have the capacity to be a price maker. In that case, do you still want to necessarily cooperate in this thing is a different question. So for Singapore, we're just 200% behind a rules-bound, a rules-based multilateral international system, because that's what gives us a capacity to operate. But I'm not sure that necessarily applies to the U.S., China, the big countries, etc. Right?
Well, that's true. I mean, if you look at the the voting rights on the IMF, they're unequally divided relative to economic significance at that point. And the U.S. has essentially a veto right on the IMF in terms nothing's going to happen unless the U.S. is comfortable with that, and that's probably a little bit too much power for any one country. I mean, ideally, you hope that the country that's sort of in that lead position is enlightened. And I think I'm actually pretty pleased with the conversation I had an opportunity to have with Treasury Secretary Yellen a couple of weeks ago, where she talked about the fact that we do have these global goods and that we have to solve for. Climate change is the most important one of them. And so the fact that the U.S. is recognizing the fact that they can't do it all on their own, I think is that first necessary condition to actually making progress on this going forward. In fact, she basically told the World Bank that World Bank needs to think about how it's going to reconfigure itself to be reorienting itself so it can actually address these global goods problems that we have going forward. So I thought it was an important step.
Well, just sticking to the sovereign debt issue for a second, one of the other challenges that's changed a lot between the 80s, 90s, and now is who are the participants in the financial system? In those days, it was mostly the banking sector. And if you worked with the official sector and the banking sector, you pretty much got everybody covered. Today, there is a non-bank sector. So the biggest providers of funds are pension funds, all kinds of long-only hedge funds as well, but increasingly private capital. Right? So if you want to create a multilateral cooperation agenda, now you're talking about bringing in a whole set of new participants. What is the capacity to engage with this broader constituency, you think?
Well, I think we're not where we want to be today, because I think the private sector is sort of pushed off to the side. I mean, the IMF, historically has sort of announced to the private sector what the terms of the restructuring are going to be, leaving the private sector with having very little input to the process. The Bretton Woods Committee is doing a bunch of work on sovereign debt. We published 2 papers so far, and a third one's underway. And the basic thesis of these papers are, number one, we need a lot more transparency, because you can't restructure sovereign debt if you don't actually know how much debt there is outstanding, what the terms and conditions of that debt are, because if you don't know that, you don't know what sustainability is actually likely to look for. So the first thing is we've been pushing the notion that we need a lot more transparency in the sovereign debt space. The good news is there are some important initiatives there. There's a whole reporting regime now of data going into the OECD, so we can actually get better information. But where we haven't made much progress is that we have to get China involved in this, because China is the biggest creditor to the emerging markets in the world. And if they're not involved, then this isn't going to really work. And as you know, I mean, the Common Framework and the Paris Club, it's just not inclusive enough to make this really workable. So private sector, we think definitely you want to get them engaged, but we're not there yet. And I think that's something we really have to work with, because, as you know, I mean, the resources of the IMF are small relative to the resources of the private sector. My personal view is you have more transparency, you get the private sector involved. That gives you the possibility to actually tap a substantially greater set of resources for lower income, moderate income countries.
So I do want to get to the other parts of the agenda, but before that, I'm going to take up this thing you talked about. How do you make the IFIs, the financial institution, that's more representative of today's world? How do you bring in China, for example? So this idea of IFI reform, or what we could do, and how do you make a platform which is more representative? What are your thoughts on that, and is there a way forward?
Well, we are just starting a working group to try to take this on as much. There's a lot of work going on this around the world. I mean, I think, if we want to step back a bit and sort of think about what went wrong. I mean, to me, a very, important moment for me was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Because the theory of the case was that in a globalized economy, with everyone having codependencies across countries, a country would not invade another sovereign country because, one, it would not be good for their economy, and two, because there would be sanctions that would make their economic performance work. So the theory of the case was Putin would basically say, this isn't going to be worth it. But we saw that Putin was not deterred, and he invaded Ukraine anyway. So that suggests that we need to really think, does the whole theory of the case in terms of the deterrent of bad behavior of countries violating sovereign borders, does that still hold the case? The second thing is, obviously, how do you get someone like Putin to back down now that he's done this? Again, that's sort of a failure of the global regime, because there's no obvious exit strategy that we've actually been able to devise yet in terms of what's happening between UK and Russia. So that's a failure in a sort of specific case. But I think there's also a broader failure. I mean, I don't think the IMF and the World Bank are fit for purpose relative to the problems that we have today. They were set up with a very country-specific focus and orientation. And as you know, some of the problems we have today are much broader based than that. I mean, climate is the one that most obviously comes to the fore. If maybe we could switch to climate.
Okay, so when we talk about climate,
because I want to ask,
what is it that we're trying to do at the committee, and how do you feel about it?
Well, we're just getting started on the climate change agenda, and I think what we're really focused on is something that we think is more in the Bretton Woods Committee wheelhouse, which is climate finance. How do you actually motivate the flow of money to economies that can actually do the most to reduce carbon emissions at the lowest cost? I think right now we have sort of this, the resources are in places that probably don't have as much capacity to reduce carbon relative to the countries that don't have the resources, who probably have the lowest, have the highest efficiency benefit of reducing carbon if they could have the resources. So I think that we really need an international regime here. So the next dollar spent on carbon reduction goes to the country where it's most efficient to actually do that. And right now we don't have a regime like that in place. I mean, how do you think about the whole climate issue? What are you expecting to come out of the COP27? How do you see this moving forward? I mean, there have been a lot of pledges made, but it seems like we're pretty easy like making pledges. We're not very good at actually then going forward with the steps necessary to actually achieve those objectives. And what's your perspective on all this?
Well, my perspective on this is I'm sort of going to begin to sound like Diego and Balaji now for a second. but in my view, see, look at all the pledges that were made in terms of north to south flows of funds. Right? The pledges are $100 billion a year. The $100 billion a year haven't happened because on a G2G basis, governments find it very hard to fit this capacity to be able to put money into the fiscal budgets, right? So not easy given all the other domestic needs that they have. So it doesn't happen. But there's a bigger problem. And the problem is $100 billion a year
is peanuts.
It's peanuts. It's just not enough. So it's not enough, and even that doesn't happen. So what do you need to do? There is only one place. There's enough money in the world. You're talking trillions. So the only way to make this happen is to crowd in the private sector. And so there's a great case where governments and states will not make it happen. You need the private sector to be able to make money happen. Now, what motivates the private sector?
Profits.
And markets. You've got to have a market. And if you have a market, then people will move the money because the market economy will force you to allocate capital or allocate resources in a meaningful way. And therefore, the underlying need for that thinking behind that, you've got to create a carbon market. And the minute you have a robust and meaningful carbon market where carbon is priced, so creating carbon is priced negatively and sequestering carbon is priced positively, you get a market. So people who are creating carbon have to pay a price. People who can sequester and absorb carbon get a value for it. The minute you have a market, you'll create in private this thing. That's how private capital markets work. So to do that, you've got to have a consistent way to price carbon around the world. And that's something I think you can try and get harmonization around. Not easy, because the minute you impose a carbon tax in most economies, it creates a huge burden on the existing infrastructure economy. But with some transitions and pathways, I think that is something that's possible. Create a common understanding of the price for carbon. The Europeans, through the regulatory compliance market, right, their carbon there trades at 75, 80 euro a ton. Right? In the voluntary carbon market, which is not Europe kind compliance, prices are moving. So we have something called a climate impact tax. It's a carbon exchange with 2 or 3 other players we created last year. We just did our first auction, public auction, 3 days ago. And 250,000 tons of carbon cleared at $27.50. The generally traded price for carbon, voluntary carbon, has been $8 to $10. It got up to 13, 14, came back to 8, 10. So at $27.50, it was a step change in terms of what people are willing to pay for good quality carbon credits. Now, what does that do? It takes, by the way, this was a mangrove project out of Pakistan. So what does it do? It takes the mangrove project from Pakistan, It allows those people to earn 27.50 a ton. And who bought most of the carbon? Institutions from around the world, particularly in Europe. Now, that's private sector mobilization of capital from the north to the south. And if you can start scaling this up and get the carbon markets to function, you will have that. Now, that requires a few things, which you got to have high quality. The reason carbon markets didn't get created after Kyoto Protocol, it's very opaque. Nobody knows, are you really sequestering carbon? Nobody knows, what is the total externality carbon you create. So there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done in terms of measurements, in terms of common taxonomy, in terms of disclosures. But I think that's the path of travel.
Sounds like you need a referee too to, sort of validate the claims of how much carbon actually has been eliminated. To establish sort of ground rules. I mean, there's some question about whether the World Bank could actually take a lead role in this.
I think there's an opportunity. The World Bank has a registry which we're trying to get them to set up in Singapore. And the registry actually documents every project and creates a central record-keeping base. And of course, in the world of blockchain, you don't even need that. But it still doesn't do the accreditation. It doesn't do the verification accreditation. So far, that's being done by individual players. Silvera, Truecost, etc. do this. One of the things that we've tried to position the Singapore Exchange as is dealing in high-quality carbon credits. So we go through a process of verification and accreditation to make sure what comes on the exchange is valid. But your underlying point is this is a great case for where you need a global standard, a referee to make sure this thing is kosher and people are willing to invest in it, I think.
So what's your assessment of the possibility for real progress? The problem with this is partly it's such a long, such a slow-moving process, but existential that it's so easy for people just to say, well, we'll get to it next year.
Yeah. So I'll take the glass half empty view first. And that's two or three things. Number one, actually most immediate, is after Russia, Ukraine, and the energy crisis. I think the world started figuring energy security as important as, sustainable or green energy. And frankly, it's something which many people in the South have argued before. This cannot be a binary process. You got to have considered and thought through transition pathway. We at DBS announced some weeks ago pathways to net zero for 7 different industry segments, starting from carbon intensity today to where we want it to be in 2030. And it's bespoke. We got to work with clients and figure out what's the right pathway to go from here to there. But, it can't be done overnight. But I think that's one half empty. The other half empty problem is what Economist article this week was absolutely right. I don't know if you read it. It says, forget 1.5 degrees, it's not happening. Because where we haven't met a single goal, and of our 9 planetary boundaries, 5 of them we've already exceeded. So the notion that between now and 2030, we're going to be able to suddenly tip back and get to 1.5 is not happening. So we got to start accepting that and figure what we're going to do. But that's the half empty. The half full. So the half full, first of all, climate is on the agenda today at the end of 2016, the COP in Paris, more than it's ever been. So earlier it was at the periphery. Maybe some NGOs talked about it. Some governments talked about it. Today, there is no private sector company in the world for whom the climate agenda is not one of the top 1 or 2 priorities. And that's a massive game changer. So companies like ours, for example, in the last 4 years, we've been fixated on saying, how do you actually get to net zero? What are your pathways? And we're all working very hard to try to get, in a credible way, to get to where we need to be. And once you have so many, 3,000 companies over the COVID period, made net zero commitments for 2050. Now, I'm normally skeptical. So I figured 3,000 of them, 1,500 of these guys are wishing, 4 generations after me, somebody will solve the problem. But maybe the other 1,500 are well-meaning and well-intentioned. And they're willing to speak with the wallet. So they're willing to put money behind carbon markets. They're willing to, and these include energy companies, these include financial services companies. So I think the train has left the station. And I can see enough energy around the problem today. But what you said is correct. It still needs some global rules. It needs some global players. It needs a lot of work still. No question.
And the regulators are also getting more interested in this, from a perspective of making sure that what's claimed actually is real as opposed to, not real.
Yeah. So just in the few minutes we have, Bill, so you talked about climate. What else is on the Bretton Woods agenda, what we're looking at and what we're exploring doing?
So we still have a lot more work on digital finance to come. So we've committed to an 8 brief cycle. We've done 4 We have at least 4 more to go. So the next one's going to be about market integrity, investor protection. We have one on governance, because we think governance of the digital finance space is hugely important. We think it doesn't get enough attention. So that's going to be coming out in the next few months. We have another paper coming on down the line for sovereign debt. We're just spinning up the climate finance work. We're just spinning up the multilateral cooperation, coordination, global governance work. So Emily and her crew have a really full agenda. So we're actually adding people to our secretariat so we can actually have the resources to manage what's a bigger and bigger agenda. So we're very happy. To grow the Bretton Woods Committee the way we want it to be, we have to grow the membership. We have to grow the finances, we have to grow the secretariat, and we have to grow the work. And so each of these 4 things, we're sort of growing up together. And sometimes one grows a little faster than the other. We get a little bit out of whack. Right now, the constraint is the resources of the secretariat. These guys have, just the amount of work that came together just to put on this event was extraordinary. And this comes only like a month after, how many different things did we have going on the week of IMF meetings? We had 13 events on the week of the IMF meetings last month. So they've been working really hard. That's an understatement. So we're hoping, while we're here, we're going to try to get some more people interested in joining the Bretton Woods Committee, both as individuals or as corporate sponsors. DBS, just emulate this guy here. He's been one of the best corporate sponsors we could possibly have, not just in the sense of that DBS is involved, but he personally is involved. His staff is involved. And so we very much appreciate that.
So you need to talk to Sop. He's the guy.
Well, I think there's more than one guy.
All right, Bill. Thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time and giving us the opportunity to talk to what the work agenda for Bretton Woods is. I do think that trying to get this multilateral arrangement going is really crucial. I think in the long run, getting the Chinese in is going to be our biggest challenge and our biggest opportunity. So that's something that we really need to work very hard on.
We're very welcome, open to suggestions of how to get. We've been making a lot of outreach to people that we know that have Chinese connections. We have a couple people involved with Bretton Woods from China, but right now the people are pretty reluctant to get engaged because the Chinese government is reluctant to have them engaged. So we have to sort of solve that problem and get the Chinese government to understand the Bretton Woods Committee is not an instrument of the U.S. government. We're not. We're completely independent. And anybody who knows me would understand that my agenda is global. It's not. I do not have a U.S. focused agenda, and neither does anybody else associated with the Bretton Woods Committee that I'm aware of.
All right. On that note, thank you. Please join me in giving Bill a round of applause.
Thank you.